Hey, greetings, everyone. Lieutenant Colonel Alan West here, the Executive Director of the American Constitutional Rights Union and the ACRU Action Fund. First and foremost, once again, I just want to say Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to everyone that is out there. And I think it's going to be a pretty interesting new year. And when you look at some of the things that are already taking shape in a foreign policy perspective, it is very clear that the Trump effect is taking hold across the world. And you look at some of the global leaders that are coming down to Mar-a-Lago and meeting with the president, or you saw the handshake that was seen around the world between President Trump and French President Macron. It's pretty interesting what's going on. But there's nothing more interesting, I think, right now that points to where we are foreign policy wise than the collapse of Syria. I want you to think about something. We're talking about a very brutal totalitarian regime that had been in power there in Syria for some 50 years between the current Bashar al-Assad and then his father, Hafez Assad, before that. And we know that this is a regime that has done many horrific things to their own people. It's so kind of funny to me how we always have these people that take to the streets and try to condemn Israel. United Nations always condemning Israel. But we never hear about how people condemn these nations that bring these chemical weapons and things of that nature to bear against their own people. But I want to tell you right now, to all of those folks out there that were taking these anti Semitic stances, anti Israel stances, going out and supporting Islamic terrorist organizations, hat tip to Israel for what they have done. Because if Israel had listened to all of those people talking about going into a ceasefire, taking their foot off of the pedal, you would not see the decimation of Hamas and Hezbollah. You would not see Iran in a position of weakness right now where their air defense systems have been severely degraded. I mean, the Hamas and Hezbollah leadership has been cut off. Hezbollah, which bolstered some of the most, most incredible amounts of rockets and missiles, 80% degraded and gone. Hezbollah has pretty much gone into a unconditional surrender agreement with Israel. They backed off some 20 to 30 miles from the border there and ceded that territory over to Israel. So I think that through it all, the Israeli Defense Force and Prime Minister Netanyahu have to be congratulated for the resolve that they've shown, which has really helped the world to be in a position of moving toward peace in the Middle East, something that we were moving toward in the first Trump administration with the Abraham Accords. But there is a realignment that is going on because what has happened with the fall of Syria does not just affect Assad and his regime. It does not just affect Iran. It does not just isolate Hezbollah as well as Hamas, but it also affects another one of our geopolitical foes, and that's Russia. Roll a couple of informative tapes that kind of gives an analysis of how this affects Russia.
The former commander of Russian forces in Syria and now member of parliament is already warning Russia's leadership not to make concessions. Any gesture of goodwill in the Middle East is perceived as weakness. Weakness is unacceptable, he says. What should be done in this situation, he's asked. Talk from a position of strength, he answers.
I don't think Russia is in a position of strength. Because what Russia has done in military terms, they have far overextended its lines of communication, the means by which they can support their foreign endeavors and exploits. They're bogged down in Ukraine in an operation which is yielding no real results. I mean, it's pretty stagnant right now. And now they have seen their client state in Syria. And understand, back in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, when somehow we got Syria to work on our side, part of the coalition against Iraqi Saddam Hussein, President Saddam Hussein, Syria's army was all Russian equipment. I mean, we had to be very careful in which T-72 tanks we were shooting at because Iraq also had Russian equipment. See, what Syria provided to Russia was that warm water port they were always wanting to have. And then furthermore, with Iran, what Syria provided was that land bridge from Tehran through Iraq all the way over to the Mediterranean. And also, it was the means by which they could provide weapons and support down to Hezbollah. That's all gone now. And so I don't think that Russia has the ability to operate from a position of strength. And now all of a sudden you have the return of the old sheriff in Donald Trump. And what do you think Donald Trump is going to do? He's going to restore the American oil and gas independence, our energy independence. It means that once again here in Port Arthur, Texas, it will be the number one exporter of liquefied natural gas, something that the Biden-Harris administration undermined. So that means that we can have these countries that are going to come to the United States of America, not Russia, which would dry up their resources even more. So I don't believe that Vladimir Putin, who was obviously caught by surprise with this collapse, is pretty happy and is going to be in a position of strength in Syria in any way, shape, form, or fashion. Let's look at what they were talking about on Russian news agencies.
How much power does Russia still hold in Syria? Kremlin-controlled TV strategizes over what might come next, with maps showing Russia's bases in Syria. A guest acknowledges Moscow was caught off guard again. Thinking about how it all happened in Syria reminds me about how it all happened in Ukraine in 2014, he says. I want to highlight one universal lesson for world powers. Don't take wishful thinking for reality. When a power is crumbling in days and can't protect itself, this is a verdict. For years, it was the Russian military that kept the Assad regime afloat. Russia's Air Force pounding rebel groups, its Navy firing cruise missiles at ISIS militants in eastern Syria. In return, Assad gave Moscow a 49-year lease on both its main airbase near Latakia and a military port in Tartus, allowing Vladimir Putin to project power throughout the Middle East. The fact that Russia has its military assets in Syria also makes Moscow a key player in the Middle East. But now the Russians acknowledge that that status is in jeopardy.
It's not just in jeopardy. They've lost that status. And again, there's going to be a shift there within the Middle East. But what we have to be very wary of, what we have to pay a lot of attention to, we cannot be exuberant and so happy that we've seen the fall of Bashar al-Assad, because it creates a void. And of course, what fills that void? And if your memory is good enough, you remember that once upon a time, the United States of America outsourced its military intelligence assets, it outsourced its air assets to support rebels in Libya against Muammar Gaddafi. And look what happened with that. I mean, Muammar Gaddafi, not a good guy. Let's be very honest. But Muammar Gaddafi was pretty much so a toothless dictator. And there were means by which we could leverage Muammar Gaddafi for our own intents and purposes. But what we ended up doing in Libya was that we supported what ended up being ISIS. And let's not forget that the consequences and ramifications thereof of allowing that vacuum to occur in Libya. And I remember it because I was in Congress at the time and I spoke out against us providing that type of military support, was that we lost an ambassador. We lost a State Department communications specialist. We lost 2 former Navy SEALs. Why was the CIA there in Libya? Was to try to collect up the weapons from those rebel factions that we had supported. So we cannot be too fast in going in and saying, yay, it's a great thing that Bashar al-Assad is gone. Because when you look at these rebel forces, the leader of these rebel forces, well, he has ties to ISIS. He has ties to al-Qaeda. He, of course, has come back and said, no, I have renounced that. I'm not the same guy. I don't think so. And then furthermore, who is behind these rebel forces? I think that you will find that the president of Turkey, Erdogan, has his hands in supporting these rebel forces. And we know that Turkey's Erdogan is looking to extend that Turkish regional hegemonic dominance once again. Will they ever get back to having the Ottoman Empire? Doubt that. But he definitely wants to be an impact and an influential player there in the Middle East. And of course, we know that we have the Kurds, who are very, very strong allies to the United States of America, who helped us to rid the area of ISIS, did a lot of the fighting for us back coming out of the Obama administration into the Trump administration. We got to make sure that we don't create a greater vacuum in the Middle East, a greater void in the Middle East. And I think that's what Israel, once again, has recognized, and they're already taking actions. Roll the tape.
This footage shows just part of a massive Israeli attack on Syrian military assets. The IDF says it's launched nearly 500 strikes on the country since Bashar al-Assad's regime fell over the weekend, targeting his navy, airfields, chemical weapons, and arms production. According to Israel's foreign minister, the goal is to prevent any weapons from falling, quote, into the hands of extremists. Israel's also sent ground forces into Syria, both into and beyond a demilitarized zone that separates the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights from the rest of Syria. The government says they're establishing a new security zone and, quote, will not allow any hostile force to establish itself on our border. Arab states have condemned Israel for taking advantage of Assad's collapse to execute what they call a land grab.
See, I don't think it is a land grab. I think, as that report articulated, this is extending a security buffer zone to make sure that you don't have these bad elements that can come in and occupy that terrain. And furthermore, let's thank Israel again for these very precise targeted strikes against the military capability and capacity that we saw left behind there that could have been exploited by these terrorist organizations, unlike what we saw with our own Biden-Harris administration and the debacle of Afghanistan, where we left some $80 to $85 billion of military equipment there for them by way of ground transport, aerial transport, helicopters, small arms, things of this nature. So Israel is doing the right thing to make sure that the wrong people don't come in and have the ability to, well, fill that void. And the next thing you know, you have even worse terrorist activities that are being targeted against Israel. So with the new Trump administration coming in, I think without a doubt, you're going to see an incredible shift in the Middle East. As a matter of fact, even Qatar has already told the remaining leaders of Hamas to get out of their country. Iran will be bankrupt once again, and hopefully it will stay that way. We see the decimation of Islamic terrorist organizations, Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, and that should extend to Al-Quds, Al-Aqsa, Martyrs Brigade, and any other terrorist elements. But we also see some of these state sponsors of terrorism that are going to be defeated. Like I said, Iran and also Syria. And we see a reshaping of the alliances there. Russia is not going to any longer have that footprint there in the Mediterranean. So Russia is not in a position of strength. That's a good thing, because as we start to reestablish our energy independence and energy dominance, what will affect the economy of Russia, that means that it will affect China as well. As we start to tighten up on the sanctions against Iran, that means that Iran, their coffers will dry up and they won't be able to ship drones to Russia to be used in Ukraine. That means that China is going to be further isolated, our number one geopolitical foe, which means that North Korea will also be undermined as well. So I think that as we head into 2025, we see a good foreign policy position for the Trump administration to come in. And again, hat tip to the Israeli Defense Forces and Prime Minister Netanyahu for showing the resolve to stand up and do some of the things that the Biden-Harris administration did not support them in doing. God bless, and thank you for joining us on this episode of Live Free TV.